I'm Andreas Eenfeldt from dietdoctor.com, and I'm here with someone who knows a lot about what is wrong in our current understanding about diet and health. Dr Attia, medical doctor and a popular blogger, and a co-worker with Gary Taubes. So thanks for being here.
Well, thanks very much for having me here today.
So could you just tell a little bit about yourself and how you got all interested in this diet and health and bad science?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's always something I've been interested in, health and nutrition, primarily driven by my interest in athletic performance and things like that. But, you know, up until about 3 or 4 years ago, I sort of subscribed to the conventional wisdom, which was that high amounts of carbohydrates were necessary to sustain peak physical performance. Fats, and primarily saturated fats, should be avoided. High amounts of protein were necessary to maintain an anabolic state, etc. It kind of all came to a head in 2009 when, after a slow witnessed progression, I had sort of morphed from the lean person I was in high school into a very non-lean person, to put it mildly. And in fact, the real turning point came in September of that year, when I had just become maybe one of a dozen people to swim from Los Angeles to Catalina Island and Catalina Island back, the 2 separate crossings. And so I was fit as a fiddle, swimming 4 hours a day and training, and yet I had ballooned to you know, about 40 pounds above what I am today. And worse yet, a lot of the metabolic parameters in my body were also reflecting that. I had elevated triglycerides, profoundly depressed HDL cholesterol. My waist was, you know, obviously much larger than it should have been. And so basically I was sort of on the fence of metabolic syndrome. And this struck me as problematic because I was, on paper, doing all the right things. I was eating a diet that was very high in refined carbohydrates, or more importantly, whole grains, fruits and vegetables. Refined carbohydrates, but they seemed acceptable if you were exercising as much as I was. Lean protein, very little saturated fat. And so that really began this search for, am I doing something wrong?
You were supposedly doing everything right, and still it wasn't working.
That's correct.
So what did you find?
Well, I started doing some reading and came across some literature that suggested that the simpler carbohydrates may be overriding my body's system to oxidize fat. So despite all that exercise I was doing, it was quite likely that I was doing it in an environment of a constantly elevated insulin level, and doing so was paradoxically turning off my body's ability to access its internal fat stores. So you're effectively putting a lot of paper on the fire, and doing so is preventing you from actually burning the logs.
Right, and when you say simple carbohydrates, what are you talking about?
Well, in the sort of parlance of the sports nutrition world, this was a lot of the maltodextrin products, which of course are often filled with high fructose corn syrup. People love to talk about how high fructose corn syrup is preferentially turned into hepatic glycogen over glucose. And then of course, from a dietary standpoint, you know, I was eating copious amounts of rice and pasta and bread and things like that, always, you know, quote unquote carbo loading before these long workouts, and immediately refueling with the same thing upon completion of these workouts.
Okay, so you found some literature suggesting that this could be a problem.
Yeah, so I decided to do a very simple experiment on myself, which was, what if I just eliminated anything in my diet that contains sucrose and high fructose corn syrup? So I was certainly nowhere near willing to consider that maybe starches in general were contributing to the problem, but I wanted to see what happened if I just took out anything with sucrose and high fructose corn syrup. And so I did that. And over the next 4 months, an amazing thing happened, which was, obviously removing those things removes a number of other things. So it didn't mean it meant that if I was going to eat spaghetti, I needed to make my own spaghetti sauce out of tomatoes and garlic and things like that. I couldn't use something out of a can or a jar because, much to my surprise, the third ingredient in that product was sugar. It meant that I still ate bread, but I had to search long and hard to find a brand that didn't have ingredient number 2 or 3 being sugar. And so I lost about 20 pounds in 4 months, and
Wow.
felt much better and was performing much better. And that just piqued my curiosity, frankly. That just made me want to know what was the next level in this. Could I take things to another level. My triglycerides had fallen from about 154 milligrams per deciliter to about 100. HDL had gone up from where it started at about 30 milligrams per deciliter to now about 45. So things seem to be moving in the right direction. And you know, I just sort of asked the natural question, which is what happens if I pull this lever a little bit harder?
Yeah, so what happens?
You know, everything just continued. And so over the period of effectively a year and a half, I went through this gradual period of carbohydrate reduction, which, by the way, was not without its difficulties. As anyone who's tried to reduce carbohydrates knows, each of these new steps is met with a new challenge. But gradually I reduced it to the point where in the spring of 2011, I was sort of teetering with what we would call a ketogenic diet. Effectively the complete removal of carbohydrates, certainly the removal of all starches and sugars, and even a reduction in my case in the amount of protein I was consuming for reasons that I'm sure other interviewees you've had have discussed when sort of formulating a well put together ketogenic diet. And so I decided to go on a 12-week experiment into nutritional ketosis, where carbohydrates were limited to about 30 grams per day, protein was limited to about 120 grams per day, and my fat intake made up the remainder. And you know, to be honest with you, the first few weeks of that were horrible. So horrible, in fact, that were it not for the fact that I'd committed to doing 12 weeks, at least to myself, I would have probably abandoned it. It turned out I was making many of the common mistakes that people make when doing that.
So when you say horrible, sorry, what does that mean?
Well, you know, I was very lightheaded. My performance athletically took a huge turn for the worse. I just didn't feel well.
What kind of sports?
Cycling, swimming, high-intensity weight training, that sort of thing.
Okay, so hard time getting into that. What happened?
Well, I was fortunate that you know, by this time I had gotten to know Steve Phinney and Jeff Volek, among others, and you know, they were really gracious in their advice, and they quickly took a look at what I was eating and made a few suggestions, and a lot of their suggestions really panned out. Obviously, increasing sodium intake was probably the biggest single one. Supplementing elements, other minerals and things like that made a big difference. And the other one was actually making sure I really was strict on keeping that protein level low enough. Because of the nature of sort of what I was doing, it was a fine balance between getting enough protein to make sure that I wasn't sort of always in a catabolic state, but at the same time not overdoing it, which is actually a very common mistake I find people making in ketosis.
How do you do that? Overdo protein? What does that mean? Eating too much lean meat?
Yeah, or even too much fat meat. But the point is, if you're getting too much protein in, what happens is you're sort of getting a gluconeogenic effect from the protein that's effectively starting to act like carbohydrates. So to give you an example, at the onset of my foray into ketosis, I was still consuming about 240 grams a day of protein, which is what I'd consumed my entire life.
Which is still a lot, right?
Still a lot, plenty, more than enough protein. You're certainly in a positive energy balance, a nitrogen balance. The problem is at that level, the protein, a lot of it is now being processed by the liver, turned into glycogen, and you're effectively exporting glucose again. And again, for most people, that may not make that much of a difference, but when you're really trying to thread that very delicate needle of nutritional ketosis, it was enough to keep me from truly getting there. And I sort of found myself in a no man's land, which is carbohydrates were reduced to the point where, you know, I probably didn't have enough glucose to keep my brain entirely happy, but through these high levels of protein, I wasn't quite allowing my liver to make enough of, you know, the beta-hydroxybutyrate and other things like that, that my brain would need to offset its deficiency of glucose. So I was really in this kind of middle zone. And since that time, having now worked with a lot of people doing this themselves, it's certainly the first pattern I observe in someone who's struggling.
So what happened when you fixed this, reduced your protein and went into full-blown keto?
Well, it was an amazing change. You know, after struggling for weeks, within a few days, it all reverted. My serum levels of beta-hydroxybutyrate, something we would, you know, poke your finger to just monitor, got into sort of that zone we'd call the sweet spot, and I just started to feel remarkable. And in fact, When the 12 weeks was up, I just didn't want to go back. And so, you know, for about the past year and a half, I've kind of stayed in that state. And the benefits for me have been really worth the trade-offs, because let's be honest, there's a trade-off to being that strict about how many grams of this you're going to eat and how many grams of that you're going to eat. And you know, I certainly wouldn't say that that's something everyone should be doing or would want to do, but for me it made a difference, because primarily from an endurance athlete standpoint, which is something I'm like kind of a wannabe endurance athlete, I really like the idea that I can go out for very long bike rides, do very long swims, do things like that. And my body has become so metabolically flexible at accessing fat stores that I really require very little supplemental substrate for glucose production.
So you can just go out and ride your bike for hours or what?
Yeah, my record so far on a 20, so I've done a number of these sort of funny experiments on myself. My record so far is 24 hours of fasting and then a 6-hour bike ride.
Wow. With
just water.
Wow.
And sodium, actually. You do need some sodium.
How did that go for you?
It went really well. I mean, by the time I finished that bike ride, my, not to get too technical, my beta-hydroxybutyrate level was over 5 millimolars.
Pretty high,
which is pretty high. That's about the level at which even the pancreas now starts to secrete insulin in response to the ketones to keep them in check. That's what prevents me from getting into ketoacidosis, of course. But it was a remarkable experience to be able to sort of start to push the bounds of what the body can do if you truly allow it to access its own internal stores of fat.
So what happened to your health in general when you, year and a half in strict ketogenic state, weight and other parameters?
Yeah, I mean, everything just kind of continued to move in the correct direction. Insulin resistance was something, I had documented insulin resistance through, the standard tests you would use, an oral glucose tolerance test, HOMA-IR, all of the sort of metrics you would use to measure insulin resistance were there, in addition to, the proxies we use. For example, looking at a ratio of triglyceride to HDL cholesterol is a great proxy for insulin resistance. And when I started out, that ratio was about 6. That ratio obviously fell to below 1, which is really where you'd want to be.
It's a big change. Huh?
Enormous change. Fasting insulin levels, fasting glucose levels fall, hemoglobin A1C reduced, waist circumference shrunk, 40 pounds lighter, much lower reduction, a much lower percentage of body fat. All these sort of things that were, risks to my health in the not too distant future, all of a sudden have been, I believe, put on a slower course.
So anything negative? I mean, you hear a lot in blogs and even from doctors and other people about the dangers of ketosis. I mean, you're supposed to be, you need glucose for your brain and you need to exercise. Obviously, that doesn't seem to be the case. But do you get depressed? Do you feel tired? Do you get hypothyroid? All these kinds of
well, I'm a pretty relentless self-experimenter, and I've followed all of these parameters in me. So to answer your question, I mean, obviously, I hope I've been able to at least demonstrate that a well-formulated ketogenic diet isn't bad for your brain, in the sense that your brain can obviously access beta-hydroxybutyrate, and that's the purpose of it. But some of these other points are really interesting to note. I mean, there's certainly a lot of discussion about cortisol and thyroid function, other endocrine function. I don't think it's that exciting to comment on one individual's experience, but nevertheless, in my personal experience, I have not experienced those things. So I have not seen a rise in my, C-reactive protein or homocysteine levels or any of these other markers, at least not one that's statistically significant. I'm checking my levels so frequently on this stuff that the other thing people need to keep in mind is there's so much variation based on time of day. In fact, to give you an example, about a month ago I did an experiment in collaboration with a laboratory called Health Diagnostics Laboratory, where we did 9 different blood tests in 3 days, but we timed them around my workouts. So you do an early morning workout, you do an early morning blood test, and these are 5-6 tubes of blood, go out and do a 4-hour workout, come back and repeat it, rest for 4 hours, repeat it. And we did this over the course of 3 days. So, 2 units of blood I gave up for this.
You test your blood a lot more than most people, right?
That's right, I certainly do. But I did this because I had a hunch that the activities in our day, the timing of when we tested, impacted the results. And this turned out to be true. There was remarkable variation in my blood markers just as a function of when I was testing them. And not surprisingly, after hard workouts, a lot of those inflammatory markers were higher than first thing in the morning when I've had a night of sleep. And so I think that the concerns that people put forth are really valid. I think they mostly stem from people possibly not incorporating the well-formulated total package together. So for example, if you fail to utilize enough sodium in your diet, your body is going to start wasting other minerals in an attempt to compensate, right? Your kidneys are going to start secreting more aldosterone, you're going to start trading sodium for potassium, you're going to start getting into cramping and muscle wasting, all these sort of things. So
basically it's important to get enough salt, right?
Salt is a very important one, but it's also just important to pay attention to the overall. Jeff and Steve have written a wonderful book called The Art and Science of Low-Carbohydrate Living, and I think it's an appropriate title because there's a lot of science that supports this, but ultimately we're still in the early stages of understanding how to apply this diet to people in the 21st century, and that's where there's just a little bit of art to it. And frankly, everyone is different. I mean, there are some people that I've worked with who have sailed into ketosis. They never went through the problems I went into, and there are others for whom it just doesn't seem to work that well. It doesn't offer enough of an advantage over just a well-formulated low-carbohydrate diet, and for those people, I just don't think it makes sense. So really, customization and personalization matters more than anything.
Right, and in your experience, who should expect to gain a lot of benefits from a ketogenic diet, very strict low-carb diet?
Boy, if I knew the answer to that question, I could do a lot more for people. I have to be honest with you, I don't know yet. I'm still in my own infancy of really trying to understand a priori who is going to do really well on this versus who is not. I have picked up a few things. Within the athletic sphere, athletes who are primarily aerobic tend to do better. Athletes who are primarily anaerobic don't tend to do as well. So if you are someone who is training for the 400-meter sprint or the 100-meter sprint or the 100-yard freestyle or something like that, and that's really your focus, the ketogenic diet doesn't seem to offer much for you. If, however, you're training for a marathon or a triathlon or something like that, there seems to be a much greater benefit you get from what I refer to as this metabolic flexibility, this ability to operate at that sort of 70% of VO2 max for very extended periods of time in the presence of a very low RQ, which means at an intensity where most people are primarily turning over to glycogen dependence, you are still 70% dependent on fat oxidation.
Means you get a greater endurance, for example.
What you do is you basically avoid a lot of the metabolic problems that plague athletes. I've been a sort of ultra-distance endurance person my whole life, and one of the things I've noticed is many people fail metabolically. They don't fail because their cardiovascular systems aren't robust enough to handle it. So, 7-8 hours into a swim, you'll get a lot of people who, sort of fall off a cliff. And it's because they're failing at a cellular level, they're failing at a metabolic level, they're failing at an oxidative level. They're not failing because their shoulders are too sore. They're not failing because their heart and lungs can't pump hard enough. And so it's that very particular athlete. And the same is true for the person who's running the marathon or doing these other things. There's a huge advantage to this. There's another demographic that has found a real benefit from this, and I happened upon this by accident, working with some clients. It's the person who really places a premium on mental acuity. I noticed this in myself, but only as an afterthought, because it wasn't something I was actively looking for. I used to constantly feel tired in the afternoons. Between the hours of about 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the evening, I just wasn't myself. I wasn't productive. I didn't quite have the same focus. one of the things I noticed, but again, only after thinking about it in retrospect, was once I completely eliminated glucose from my life, that went away. In fact, as the day went on, I seemed to get sharper, usually as a result, I suspected, of my ketone levels rising. And so I noticed this then in a couple of clients later on who said, you know, the most exciting thing is I don't have to drink 4 Red Bulls a day anymore to stay focused at, you know, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, you know, and I had one client who's, you know, running a hedge fund. So for him, there's nothing more important than being completely and maniacally focused on what's going on in the markets 24 hours a day.
So his brain needs to work.
Absolutely. And you know, he came to me after a few weeks and said, you know, it's great that I've taken 3 inches off my waist and I don't have to take my blood pressure medication anymore, but I don't really care about that. What I care about is that I have laser-like focus 24 hours a day. And so, you know, again, it really comes down to these trade-offs. What matters to people?
I have a cool story about that, if you want to hear it.
I'd love to.
The Swedish champion in memory, you know, memorizing, you know, 10 stacks of playing cards and stuff like that. He's got all the Swedish records in that, and he's ranked at one of the top memories of all time. And he's eating a strict ketogenic diet when he's doing the competitions.
That's
keep
very
the focus
interesting.
For a long time, right? Like you're.
That's very interesting.
Like what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. So, I think there's something to this. I think, you know, when you look at how narrow a band of glucose our brain kind of wants to be happy in, and you imagine how difficult the task that is to balance with your own intake and hepatic glucose output, in addition to all the gluconeogenic pathways going on behind that, it's not surprising that if you could simplify that process and provide a different substrate for which you could guarantee a more even supply, performance should improve, cognitive performance.
Cool. So we're going to talk more in a second interview, but if people want to read more about your ideas and your thoughts on this, I know they can go to your blog at the Eating Academy. What's the address?
Yeah, the URL is eatingacademy.com.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Eatingacademy.com, and I'm going to put up a link below this video. So thank you so much for this interview. It's really interesting stuff.
Well, thanks for making the time. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this.